I'll break your arm and leave you disabled. My brother-in-law roared, hurling a pair of MMA gloves directly at my face. My name is Iris. I am 32 years old, and I was standing in the middle of my own living room surrounded by 15 relatives. The heavy leather gloves hit my shoulder and dropped to the hardwood floor with a dull thud. My brother-in-law stepped forward. He was a massive amateur fighter who used his size to bully everyone. He puffed out his chest, completely enraged, believing he held absolute power in my house. I looked over at my husband. The man who was supposed to protect me just stood there in the corner. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, shrinking into the background, pretending this violent threat wasn't happening right in front of him. My brother-in-law smirked. He thought he had won. He thought he was bullying a helpless woman who had absolutely no one to defend her. He made one catastrophic mistake. He was too busy flexing his ego to notice the older man sitting quietly in the armchair just a few feet away. My dad. My father sat perfectly still. His expression was completely calm, but his eyes locked onto my brother-in-law with cold, calculating precision. My brother-in-law had no idea who my dad really was, and he certainly didn't know his arrogant pride was about to be violently dismantled in exactly 15 seconds. Before I tell you how this massive bully got what he deserved, all the trouble began early last summer, right after my husband and I moved to a quiet suburb in Pearland, Texas. We had spent 4 long years saving every dollar for this place. I worked countless overtime shifts at the office to contribute exactly half of the down payment. My husband Wayne always played the role of the easygoing peacemaker. I truly believed we were finally starting a peaceful chapter. That illusion shattered completely just 3 weeks later. My brother-in-law Nelson and his wife, my sister-in-law Gloria, unexpectedly signed a lease for the property sitting directly next to our fence line. I already knew exactly who Nelson was. He constantly bragged about spending years training in mixed martial arts. During every family gathering, he always found a way to steer the conversation toward his aggressive sparring sessions. He loved boasting about using physical force to teach people a lesson. To him, intimidation was a sport, and violence was an acceptable form of communication. I had always kept my distance, but living next door meant there was absolutely no escape. The boundary violation started immediately. It was a Saturday morning when I heard a loud engine roaring outside my kitchen window. I walked to the glass and saw the wooden gate to my backyard wide open. Nelson was pushing my brand new expensive lawnmower across his overgrown grass. He had simply walked onto my property, opened my storage shed, and taken my equipment without saying a single word. I stepped outside to confront him, but the situation escalated before I could even speak. Nelson dragged my garden hose across the property line. He turned the water on full blast and started washing his massive black pickup truck. The soapy runoff flooded my clean driveway. I walked right up to him and demanded a strict explanation. I asked him why he thought he could break into my shed and use my water. Nelson did not even stop scrubbing his truck tire. He threw his soapy sponge into a plastic bucket, turned his heavy frame toward me, and sneered. "My brother's house is my house," he stated flatly, stepping closer. "Do you have a problem with that?" Before I could react to his sheer arrogance, Gloria walked out of their front door. She immediately inserted herself into the standoff. She looked at me and sighed loudly, perfectly executing her fake victim routine. "We just moved here," Gloria whined, crossing her arms to look defensive. "Money is incredibly tight right now. We have not even had time to buy groceries or landscaping tools. We are family. Why are you acting so selfish and narrow-minded over a lawnmower and a little bit of water?" She did not stop there. Gloria then casually admitted that she had walked into my kitchen earlier that morning while I was upstairs in the shower. She had opened my refrigerator and taken 2 cartons of milk, a tray of beef, and a large bowl of fresh fruit. She claimed they needed breakfast and assumed I would not mind feeding my own relatives. They were treating my hard-earned home like a free supply store. I turned around expecting Wayne to step out and put an end to this absolute madness. He was standing on our front porch watching the entire confrontation unfold. This was his brother. This was his absolute duty to draw a line and protect our property. Instead, Wayne quickly walked down the concrete steps, grabbed my arm, and pulled me back toward our front door. He did not issue a single warning to Nelson or Gloria. Once we were safely inside the hallway, Wayne lowered his voice to a frantic, terrified whisper. "Do not make a big deal out of this," he pleaded, looking nervously out the front window. "You know exactly how Nelson is. He trains in MMA. He has a terrible temper. Just let it go to keep the peace. It is only some food and some water. Please, just tolerate it." I stared at Wayne in complete shock. My husband was actively choosing to sacrifice my peace of mind to avoid confronting his brother. He was fully aware of Nelson's volatile nature, and instead of standing up to it, he demanded that I submit to it. Stepping into October, my personal privacy boundaries were completely destroyed in a way I never expected. I left the office early on a Wednesday afternoon. A blinding migraine forced me to cancel my afternoon meetings. I just wanted to lock my doors, close the blinds, and collapse onto my bed in dead silence. I pulled my car into my driveway and instantly noticed a strange silver sedan parked haphazardly, blocking my garage access. I ignored the inconvenience, dragged myself up the front steps, and reached for the handle. The door swung open before I even pushed it. It was entirely unlocked. I stepped into the hallway and froze. Echoing laughter and loud chatter bounced down the staircase. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Someone was upstairs. I gripped the banister and crept up the hardwood steps. The voices grew louder. I recognized Gloria speaking in a booming, boastful tone. I reached the second-floor landing and stared in sheer horror. Gloria was standing squarely inside my master bedroom. 3 strange women holding iced coffees stood surrounding her. Gloria had my closet doors wide open. She was actively running her hands across my hanging dresses. "This is the master suite," Gloria announced proudly to her audience, gesturing around my private sanctuary. "And downstairs is the kitchen and the living room. I told you this place was huge. Go ahead, look around." They were treating my private home like a public real estate viewing. They were trampling over my bedroom rug in their dirty street shoes. I stepped fully into the doorway, blocking their exit. The 3 strangers gasped collectively. Gloria finally noticed me and stopped, her hand still gripping my closet door handle. I demanded an immediate explanation. I ordered her to explain exactly what she was doing inside my bedroom with complete strangers. The 3 visitors panicked, muttered awkward apologies, and rushed past me. They scurried down the stairs and practically sprinted out the front door. Gloria stayed behind, entirely unfazed by my visible fury. She executed her fake ignorance routine flawlessly. She widened her eyes, tilted her head, and let out a dramatic sigh. "I thought family could be comfortable around each other," Gloria stated, waving her hand dismissively at my anger. "I just wanted to show off this beautiful house to my friends. What is there to hide? You are severely overreacting over a simple tour." She brushed past me, walking down my staircase with absolute entitlement. She did not apologize. She did not show a single ounce of remorse. I followed her down, slammed the front door behind her, and locked the deadbolt. My hands shook violently. A terrifying realization hit me like a physical blow. Gloria did not break a window. She did not force the lock. She had used a physical key. I waited 4 agonizing hours for Wayne to come home from work. The exact second he stepped through the front door, I confronted him. I did not yell. I spoke with absolute freezing clarity. I held out my hand and asked him exactly how Gloria unlocked our front door today. Wayne dropped his briefcase. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. His face instantly drained of color. He avoided my eyes, staring intensely at the baseboards. He stammered, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. He finally cracked and confessed the truth. Nelson had cornered him in the driveway 2 days ago. Nelson had aggressively demanded a spare key to our house. Wayne admitted that Nelson pressured him, and instead of defending our home, Wayne simply reached into his pocket and handed it over. Wayne desperately tried to justify his pathetic cowardice. "I thought family doesn't need to ask for permission," Wayne muttered weakly, stepping backward toward the wall. "What if he needs something urgently? What if there is an emergency next door? He is my brother. I cannot just say no to him." His excuses echoed in the silent hallway. He had literally handed over the security of our home to appease a bully. He compromised my safety just to avoid a confrontation with Nelson. I looked at Wayne and felt a deep, chilling emptiness. The foundation of my marriage cracked permanently in that exact moment. I realized I was entirely unprotected. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, the exploitation shifted into blatant and shameless theft. Gloria marched into my kitchen and dropped a massive handwritten grocery list directly onto my counter. She did not ask if Wayne and I had plans. She simply announced that my house was officially hosting the holiday dinner for 15 of their extended relatives. She dictated the entire menu, demanded expensive ingredients, and explicitly told me I was paying for every single item out of my own pocket. When I tried to object to the outrageous cost and the sudden invasion, Gloria crossed her arms and loudly lectured me about family duty. She commanded me to start cleaning the guest bathrooms immediately because her relatives expected absolute perfection. She completely stripped away my authority in my own kitchen, treating me like a hired maid. Later that same evening, Nelson walked through my hallway aggressively inspecting the rooms like a landlord preparing for an open house. He stopped right in front of my private home office. He pushed the door open, looked around, and snapped his fingers. He loudly declared that my workspace was going to be the designated drinking and poker room for the men during the party. I immediately stepped in front of him and firmly refused. I told him my office contained highly sensitive work documents and my most prized possession, a high-end laptop gifted by my father when I landed my first corporate job. I ordered him to stay out. I grabbed the doorknob, pulled it shut, and locked the deadbolt right in his face. Nelson turned violently red. His ego shattered instantly. He felt humiliated and deeply disrespected because a woman dared to deny him access to a room he wanted to claim. He slammed his fist against the wall, rattling the picture frames. He screamed that I was deliberately making him lose face in front of his incoming family. He turned to Wayne, pointed a massive finger at my husband's chest, and ordered him to handle his disobedient wife immediately. The true depth of my nightmare revealed itself the very next morning. I woke up early to the sharp metallic sound of scraping metal echoing down the hallway. I got out of bed, walked toward the noise, and froze in absolute disbelief. Wayne was kneeling on the floor in front of my office. He was tightly gripping a heavy steel screwdriver, aggressively prying the metal strike plate off my locked door. Wood splintered and cracked as he violently forced the lock open, destroying the frame. I shouted his name, demanding to know what he was doing. Wayne dropped the screwdriver. It hit the floor with a loud clang. He refused to make eye contact. He nervously wiped his sweating hands on his jeans and mumbled a pathetic excuse. He admitted he was destroying my lock because Nelson commanded him to do it. "Nelson is furious," Wayne whispered, glancing nervously toward the shared wall. "He said you embarrassed him last night. I have to open this room for the party. Please just let them use it. I cannot deal with his anger today. You are making this too difficult." My own husband was actively breaking into my secure sanctuary just to appease his aggressive brother. He chose to commit an act of vandalism against my property rather than stand up for my basic rights. He was no longer just a passive bystander ignoring the abuse. Wayne was a direct, active participant in it. I did not scream. I did not argue. I just turned my back on him. I walked straight into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I felt entirely isolated, trapped in a house that felt more like a hostile territory than a home. I needed a real ally. I needed someone who would not cower in the face of absolute arrogance. I grabbed my phone and dialed my father's number. My dad lived exactly a 1-hour drive away. He was a man of very few words, possessing a deeply intimidating, calm demeanor. He had spent his entire career working in federal law enforcement before recently retiring. He knew how to read a room, and he knew how to neutralize a threat. When he answered the phone, my voice cracked. I fought back tears and begged him to drive up for the Thanksgiving dinner. I did not explain the broken lock or the screaming matches. I just told him I desperately needed him there. My dad did not ask questions. He heard the quiet panic in my voice, promised he would arrive early, and hung up. I finally had a shield. The Thanksgiving dinner began in chaotic noise the exact second the turkey hit the table. 15 of Nelson's relatives packed tightly into my dining room. They yelled over each other, dropped food on the hardwood floor, and treated my home like a cheap buffet restaurant. They treated the space with zero respect. Dad sat in this corner armchair. He stayed completely silent. He watched every single interaction with calculated, intense focus. A few times, Nelson barked aggressive orders at me, snapping his fingers and demanding more drinks. Dad shifted his weight, preparing to stand up and intervene. I caught his eye and shook my head slightly. I needed to handle this myself. Dad slowly leaned back, keeping his sharp gaze locked firmly on Nelson. I walked away from the dining table to fetch more napkins from the back. I passed by my home office. The door was wide open. I heard a loud, wet, crunching sound. I stepped into the room and stopped dead in my tracks. Toby, my nephew, was sitting at my desk. He held a greasy piece of fried chicken in one hand and a giant cup of dark soda in the other. He was aggressively slamming his greasy fingers onto the keyboard of my work laptop. The exact laptop my father had given me. A massive puddle of spilled soda seeped directly into the motherboard. The screen flickered violently, hissed, and went completely black. I did not hesitate. I sprinted across the room, grabbed the laptop, and yanked it away from the desk. I turned to Toby and yelled at him to get out of my office immediately. Toby started crying loudly. The music in the living room stopped. The dining room went completely silent. Nelson stomped down the hallway and blocked the office doorway. His massive frame filled the space. He glared down at me, his face twisting into pure rage. "My son plays if he wants to play," Nelson growled, stepping closer to intimidate me. I refused to back down. I pointed my finger directly at the hallway. "Get out of my room right now," I commanded loudly. Nelson froze. I had just blatantly defied him in front of 15 relatives. His fragile ego shattered into a million pieces. The public humiliation instantly morphed into absolute fury. Gloria pushed her way through the crowd and started screaming. She pointed her finger at my face, shouting that I was an insane woman for yelling at a harmless child over a stupid computer. She demanded that I apologize to Toby immediately. I looked past them to find Wayne. My husband stood perfectly still near the kitchen counter. He stared at his shoes. He refused to look up. He abandoned me again in front of his entire family. Nelson completely lost his mind. He marched over to the gym duffel bag he had brought to show off his fighting gear to his cousins. He ripped the zipper open and grabbed his heavy leather MMA gloves. He turned around and hurled the gloves directly at my face. They struck my shoulder hard and hit the floor. "I will break your arm and leave you disabled," Nelson roared, his voice echoing off the walls. He lunged forward, raising his massive fist to strike me. He fully intended to physically destroy me in my own house. He never even made it 2 steps. Dad exploded from the armchair. He moved with terrifying lightning speed. Dad stepped smoothly inside Nelson's swinging arc, completely avoiding the wild punch. He grabbed Nelson's thick wrist with a grip like iron, isolating the joint instantly. Dad twisted his hips, stepping deeply into Nelson's blind spot, and snapped the arm backward. Nelson let out a choked gasp as his own forward momentum betrayed him. Dad drove his palm hard into the back of Nelson's shoulder blade, forcing the massive amateur fighter downward with brutal efficiency. Dad slammed Nelson's wide face directly into the solid wood dining table. Plates shattered. Glasses cracked, sending water and wine spilling across the wood. Dad pinned Nelson's arm into a brutal joint lock, pressing his knee sharply into the man's spine. Nelson thrashed wildly, but his body was completely trapped. He could not breathe. He could not move. The entire takedown took exactly 15 seconds. Not a single punch was thrown. Dad simply neutralized the threat, locking the giant bully down like a helpless child. Even with his face pressed hard against the wooden table, Nelson still screamed to call the police. His right arm remained completely trapped behind his back, but his left hand clawed frantically at his pants pocket. He pulled out his phone, fumbled with the cracked screen, and rapidly dialed 911. He genuinely believed he held the ultimate upper hand. He thought he could manipulate the local legal system just like he manipulated my household. He yelled into the speaker, claiming a deranged maniac had broken into the house and violently attacked him without any provocation. He demanded immediate backup, playing the role of a terrified, helpless victim perfectly. Dad did not stop him. He did not tighten the joint lock to cause more pain. He simply held Nelson securely in place, waiting patiently for the authorities to arrive. The remaining relatives backed away into the corners of the dining room, whispering nervously. 10 minutes later, heavy knocks pounded on my front door. 2 Pearland police officers burst into the hallway, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They scanned the chaotic dining room, immediately locking their eyes on the broken plates, the spilled wine, and the massive man pinned against the table. Dad smoothly released the pressure on Nelson's shoulder. He stepped backward, raising his hand slightly to show he was completely unarmed. Nelson scrambled to his feet. His face was bright red, smeared with grease and sweat. He immediately pointed a shaking finger at Dad. Gloria rushed to her husband's side, grabbing his arm and bursting into fake, hysterical tears. They launched into a synchronized, fabricated story. Nelson loudly accused Dad of unprovoked physical assault. Gloria shrieked that Dad was a dangerous criminal who tried to murder the father of her child in front of their entire family. They demanded that the officers arrest Dad immediately and throw him in a jail cell. The taller officer stepped toward Dad, his posture rigid and highly authoritative. He firmly demanded identification and an immediate explanation. Dad did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open. He handed it directly to the officer. Inside the leather casing sat a gold star badge and a rigid identification card. It clearly displayed his status: retired Federal Bureau of Investigation agent. The officer looked at the credentials. He checked the federal seal and read the name. The tension in the officer's shoulders vanished instantly. His rigid, authoritative stance dissolved into absolute professional respect. He handed the wallet back to Dad and nodded politely. The power dynamic in the room shifted so fast that Nelson actually stopped breathing. The confident smirk completely fell off his face. The officers turned their backs to Nelson and asked Dad for his official statement. Dad delivered the facts with cold, surgical precision. He stated that Nelson had aggressively thrown combat gloves at my face and lunged forward with the intent to cause severe bodily harm. I stepped forward and corroborated the statement. I informed the officers about the destroyed lock on my office door and the intentionally ruined laptop. The taller officer pulled out a notepad, wrote everything down, and closed the cover. He turned around and walked directly toward Nelson. Nelson tried to back away, stuttering desperately, trying to change his story. The officer grabbed Nelson's wrist, spun him around, and slammed him against the wall. The cold metal handcuffs clicked loudly around Nelson's wrists. The officer read him his rights and listed the exact criminal charges out loud for the entire room to hear. Nelson was placed under arrest for assault for throwing the gloves and lunging at me. He was charged with criminal mischief for actively destroying the lock on my private door and causing extensive property damage to my expensive laptop. Finally, the officer added terroristic threat, citing Nelson's explicit public threat to break my arm and leave me permanently disabled. Nelson's knees buckled. The reality of his situation crushed his arrogant pride into dust. He looked completely pathetic. Gloria dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She screamed and grabbed the officer's uniform, begging them to let her husband go. The second officer sternly ordered her to step back or face obstruction charges. Wayne stood frozen by the kitchen counter, watching his aggressive brother get dragged out of my front door in absolute disgrace. In the weeks that followed, the relentless gears of the Texas justice system began crushing their family's arrogance. Nelson was locked inside a county holding cell, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. The formal criminal charges filed against him carried severe weight in the state of Texas, because his violent threats and physical assault occurred in the presence of 15 witnesses and involved a federal law enforcement officer. During the aftermath, prosecutors refused to offer any plea deals. His permanent criminal record instantly destroyed his professional life. The commercial shipping company where he worked as a logistics coordinator fired him immediately upon receiving notification of his felony arrest. His martial arts training facility also revoked his membership and suspended his coaching credentials permanently, citing strict zero-tolerance policies against violent criminals. The household lost its primary source of income overnight. I did not stop at the criminal charges. I immediately hired an aggressive civil attorney to file a formal lawsuit against both Nelson and Gloria. I demanded full financial restitution for the extensive property damage they caused. The bill included the complete replacement cost of my ruined work laptop, the professional labor required to repair the broken door frame, and substantial financial compensation for emotional distress and intentional infliction of distress. Our lawyer moved quickly to freeze their joint bank accounts pending the court's final ruling, cutting off whatever cash reserves they had left. The heavy financial pressure suffocated their household completely. Legal defense fees for felony charges drained thousands of dollars every single week. Without income or savings, they could not even afford their basic grocery bills, let alone pay the mounting court penalties. The ultimate humiliation arrived on a crisp Saturday morning. I looked out my kitchen window and saw folding tables set up across the front lawn of the neighboring house. Gloria was standing behind the tables, desperately attempting to sell off their personal belongings to passing strangers. It was a humiliating garage sale. Months earlier, Gloria had strutted through my hallway, proudly showing off her lifestyle to her friends, as if she owned the entire neighborhood. Now she sat in a cheap lawn chair under the harsh sun, surrounded by used kitchen appliances, old clothes, and mismatched furniture. Neighbors and local residents walked past their driveway, stopping briefly to inspect the cheap items while whispering quietly behind their hands. Everyone on the block knew why they were liquidating their possessions. They were desperately raising cash to pay their criminal defense attorney and settle my civil lawsuit. Gloria kept her head bowed down, desperately trying to hide her face behind an oversized pair of sunglasses. The arrogant illusion of wealth and power vanished entirely, replaced by raw desperation and public disgrace. For a month and a half after that terrible Thanksgiving night, my phone constantly received messages and calls from Wayne. He texted me endless paragraphs of desperate apologies. He left shaking voicemails begging for a second chance. He claimed he was trapped in a difficult position between his wife and his brother. He swore he never meant to cause me any pain. I kept my phone on silent. I completely ignored every single notification. I packed a suitcase and temporarily moved into Dad's house. I needed complete isolation to process the ultimate betrayal. I refused to let Wayne manipulate my emotions any further. On Christmas Eve, I finally agreed to meet Wayne at a small neutral coffee shop downtown. He arrived looking completely exhausted. He slid into the booth across from me and immediately started pleading. He reached across the table, desperately trying to grab my hand. I pulled my hand back sharply. I did not offer a warm greeting. I did not order a drink. I did not give him any room to negotiate. I reached into my bag, pulled out a thick envelope, and slid it directly across the table. Wayne stared down at the documents. The bold letters across the top page clearly stated it was a formal petition for divorce. I had already signed the bottom line. He looked up, tears pooling in his eyes. He asked how I could throw away our entire marriage over his brother's aggressive mistakes. I stopped him right there. I leaned forward and delivered the absolute freezing truth. I told him this decision was never about Nelson. This was entirely about him. I clearly outlined his exact betrayals. I reminded him that he willingly handed over the spare key to our sanctuary without my consent. I reminded him that he picked up a screwdriver and actively destroyed the lock on my private office. He chose to act as a direct accomplice to my abuse. He sacrificed my personal safety and my mental health just to protect his own comfort. I looked him dead in the eye and stated firmly that there would be absolutely no forgiveness and no reconciliation. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out the glass doors, leaving him sitting completely alone with the legal papers. The court proceedings moved forward swiftly. Wayne initially tried to contest the asset division, hoping to drag out the process and force me to communicate with him. My lawyer shut down his attempts, immediately presenting clear documentation of our financial contributions. The judge ordered the mandatory liquidation of our suburban house. The real estate market was highly active, and the property sold to a new family within 3 weeks. The bank wired my exact half of the equity directly into my private checking account. I hired professional movers, packed up my remaining belongings, and left Pearland permanently. Wayne lost his home and his wife. He was forced to rent a cramped, cheap apartment on the opposite side of the city. We cut all contact. The legal severing was absolute. The chaos finally vanished. I used my half of the house money to secure a highly secure, quiet apartment complex closer to the city center. Tonight, I am sitting at my new kitchen island, peacefully sipping hot tea. Dad is sitting across from me, reading the evening newspaper in comfortable silence. My repaired laptop sits open on the clean granite counter. Nobody is screaming outside my window. Nobody is breaking down my doors. Nobody is demanding my submission. The silence feels incredibly expensive and absolutely earned. I finally have my life back. My experience taught me a brutal but necessary lesson. Misplaced tolerance is a direct invitation for evil to enter your home. Blood relations do not give anyone a free pass to exploit your kindness. Family is supposed to represent a protection and mutual respect, not serve as a convenient excuse for endless abuse. Personal boundaries are strictly non-negotiable. If you compromise your boundaries to keep the peace, you will eventually lose your boundaries and your peace. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. Have you ever had to permanently cut off a toxic family member or a cowardly partner to protect your own sanity? Please share your thoughts and your own survival experiences in the comments below.